He thought it was just an old jacket until every biker in the room stood up.
Your father stood in the doorway and saved 23 men.
The summer Layla Donovan turned 15, she learned that her father burned everything he cooked. Not just pancakes, everything. Toast came out black at the edges, eggs stuck to the pan and had to be scraped off in pieces. Grilled cheese turned the color of charcoal on one side and stayed pale on the other, like he could never figure out when to flip it. She used to stand in the doorway of their small kitchen in Salt Lake City and watch him work the stove with the same focused expression he gave to engine manifolds and seize brake calipers, and she never understood how a man who could feel a misaligned bearing through a wrench handle by pure vibration could not tell when butter was about to burn. He never apologized for the food. That was the thing. He just set the plate down in front of her, poured himself a black coffee, and sat across the table like burned edges were simply part of the recipe. Like they had always been there and always would be. She ate everything he made, every single time. That summer, they were living in the same house they had always lived in, a low one-story rental on the west side of Salt Lake City with a cracked driveway and a garage that leaked when it rained. The garage was where Jack Donovan truly lived. He had converted it years ago into a working shop with a hydraulic lift, 2 rolling tool chests, pegboard walls lined with wrenches and sockets, organized by size in a single fluorescent tube overhead that buzzed faintly and flickered when the temperature dropped. He did mechanical work for the neighbors and took in repair jobs on the side, and on weekends he worked on the old Harley-Davidson Electroglide that sat in the corner of the garage like a patient animal waiting to be remembered. It was a 1979 model midnight blue under the grease and years of neglect, and he had been slowly rebuilding it since before Layla could remember. She was not sure he ever intended to finish it. Some part of her suspected the bike was not a project, but a companion, something to occupy his hands when his mind needed to be somewhere quiet. That particular Saturday in July, the heat was pressing down on the city like a thumb. Layla sat on the hood of the old Chevy pickup that served as a parts vehicle, her bare feet hooked over the front bumper, reading a paperback she had borrowed from the school library 3 weeks past its return date. Her father was on his back under the Electroglide doing something to the primary chain tensioner, and the garage smelled the way it always smelled in summer, of hot metal and the faint sweetness of gear grease, and the particular dry warmth of old leather from the jacket hanging on the peg near the door. 3/8, he said, from under the bike. His voice was unhurried, the way it always was, flat and certain as a table. Layla did not look up from her book. She reached to her left where his tool roll was laid out across the Chevy hood, found the 3/8 socket by feel alone, and dropped it into his open hand. He went quiet for a moment. She heard the click of the socket seating on the ratchet, then the rhythmic sound of him working it. "Smart hands," he said. "You got your mother's brain and my stubbornness. God help you." She turned a page. "I know." He made a sound that was almost a laugh low in his chest and went back to work. That was how most of their Saturdays went. Not talking exactly, but not silent either. A kind of companionable quiet that she had grown up inside of and never thought to name until much later, when she no longer had it and understood for the first time that it was the rarest thing she had ever been given. Twice that afternoon she noticed him stop. Not because the work required it, not because a bolt was stuck or a part needed inspection, but just stop the ratchet going quiet, his body still under the bike. She could not see his face from where she sat, but she could see his legs, the worn-out work boots crossed at the ankle, and both times she noticed the stillness. She also noticed that a car had slowed on the street outside. Not stopped, just slowed. She looked up the second time. Through the open garage door, she could see a dark blue sedan moving past at a pace that was slightly too deliberate for a residential street in the middle of a summer afternoon. "What is it?" she asked. "Old habit," he said. The ratchet started again. She looked at him. He did not elaborate. He never did about certain things, and she had learned years ago to read the line between questions he would answer and questions that would land in silence, and to leave the second kind alone. Later that evening, he burned the pancakes. She ate them anyway. She did not know, sitting in that garage in the summer heat with a library book going stale in her lap, that she had less than 2 years left with him. She did not know that the slowing car meant anything beyond the ordinary anxieties of a cautious man. She did not know about the patch sewn onto the back of the old leather jacket, or about the night 20 years earlier, when her father had stood in a doorway with a shotgun and refused to move, or about the bounty that had followed him across the country like a second shadow. She knew only that he burned the food and fixed the engines and stopped ratcheting when dark-colored cars slowed outside, and that when she handed him the right socket without being asked, he made that sound low in his chest. That was almost a laugh. She knew that was enough, until it was not. Jack Donovan died on a Tuesday in March of 2024. Heart failure, the hospital said. He was 51 years old. He had gone to bed at his usual time on a Monday night and did not wake up. And Layla, who was 17 years old and sleeping in the next room, did not know anything had happened until 6 in the morning when she went to the kitchen to start coffee and found the house holding the particular quality of stillness that is different from ordinary quiet. The kind that means something has changed and will not change back. The months that followed moved the way bad months do in a blur of paperwork and strangers and rooms that smelled like nothing. The hospital. The funeral home where a soft-spoken man in a gray suit walked her through choices she had no framework to make. The bank which sent letters in envelopes with windows that Layla stopped opening after the third one. Social services, which sent a woman named Karen with a lanyard and a clipboard who sat in the living room of the house that was no longer theirs and explained in a measured voice that as a minor without a legal guardian, Layla would need to be placed while the state assessed her situation. The house was seized in April. The tools went to auction in May. The Chevy pickup, the rolling chests, the pegboard walls with everything on them, all of it cataloged and removed by people who did not know what any of it had meant. Layla was allowed a single duffel bag of personal belongings. She took her clothes. She took the library books she had never returned. She took the photograph from the kitchen counter, the only one they had ever framed, the two of them at the Utah State Fair when she was 9. Her father squinting into the sun with a corn dog in one hand, her on his shoulders with her arms straight out like wings. And she took the jacket. It had been hanging in the back of the hall closet since she could remember, wrapped in a dry cleaning bag that had gone yellow with age. She had never seen him wear it. She had asked about it once when she was small, and he had said only that it was old and that she should leave it alone. The tone he used was not unkind, but it was the same tone as the slowing cars, the kind that meant the question was finished. She pulled it out of the closet the morning social services came. She did not have a reason she could have articulated. It was enormous on her, the shoulders hanging halfway down her upper arms, the sleeves requiring 2 full rolls to free her hands. The leather was old and stiff, cracked at the elbows, stained with years of road and weather and whatever life it had lived before she was born. It weighed more than she expected. She put it in the duffel on top of everything else. The placement was a group home on the north side of Salt Lake City, a 2-story house on a street of 2-story houses that had seen better decades. It was run by a man named Frank Holden, who had the kind of face that arranged itself easily into the expression adults expected, a practiced warmth, something that looked like patience from a distance and felt like nothing up close. There were 6 other residents when Layla arrived, ranging in age from 11 to 16. Holden ran the house with a set of rules posted on the refrigerator in laminated cardstock and enforced with a consistency she recognized after the first week as not being about the children at all. Lights out at 9. No outside food. No personal calls after 7. The pantry with a combination lock that Holden opened in the morning and locked again after dinner. She had seen this kind of order before in the way certain people ran things. Order that was not about the people inside it, but about the person holding the rules. Order as control made to look like structure. She watched him. Old habit, a voice in her head said in her father's flat and certain tone. She watched the way Holden moved through the house, the route he took on his nightly checks. She learned after 2 weeks that he paused outside her room longer than any of the others. Not every night, but often enough. She did not know why. Not yet. What she did know at the end of the first week was that she was not staying. The plan took 3 weeks to build. Not because it was complicated, but because Layla was her father's daughter, which meant she did not move until she understood exactly what she was moving through. She mapped Holden's schedule. She learned the gaps, the 45 minutes on Wednesday evenings, when he left for what he called a meeting, the Saturday mornings when he drove the youngest kids to a community program and did not return until noon. She saved money from the small weekly allowance the state provided, setting aside coins and small bills in the lining of the jacket pressed flat against the old leather. By the third week, she had accumulated $4.75. She studied the bus routes. She found the highway exits. She understood that nearly 300 miles of Nevada desert lay between her and Fresno, California, and that $4.75 would not buy a bus ticket. She also understood something else. By then, something she had discovered on the night of her second week in the house when she had taken the jacket off the chair where she draped it each evening and felt running her fingers along the inner hem as she sometimes did a slight irregularity in the lining. A stiffness that should not have been there. She worked at the seam with patient fingers, the way she had learned to work a stock. Bolt, slow pressure applied in the right direction, and after several minutes of careful work, she felt the lining give along a short section near the left inside panel. Inside was a folded piece of paper, small the size of an index card. The paper yellowed with time and creased into quarters. The handwriting was her father's block letters, the same hand that labeled the sockets on the pegboard. If anything happens to me, find Dottie Donovan in Fresno, California. She knows who you are. Burn this. She read it 3 times. She did not burn it. She folded it back into quarters, pressed it into the seam, and sat in the dark of her room, listening to the house settle around her for a long time. Her father had written that note knowing he might not be there. He had put it somewhere she might find it only if she was wearing the jacket, only if she was running, only if things had gone wrong enough that she had no one left to ask. He had prepared for this with the same quiet certainty he brought to every repair job, checking the connections, making sure nothing was left loose. And he had done it without telling her, because telling her would have meant explaining everything else. She thought about the slowing cars. She thought about the jacket wrapped in its yellow dry cleaning bag at the back of the closet. She thought about him setting burned pancakes on the table without apology. He knew. He always knew this was possible. And her answer forming in the dark of that room was not grief and was not fear. It was the same thing he must have felt in the garage every time a car slowed outside the thing, underneath the emotion, the practical bedrock of a person who has already decided what matters. She thought, I am going to find out why. The night she ran was a Thursday in November, 7 weeks into her placement. Holden had been out until nearly 11 on a call he took in his car with the windows up, which he had never done before. She watched from her window. When his headlights finally cut off in the driveway, she waited another 30 minutes, then dressed in the dark. She did not dare turn on her phone light. She found her sneakers, by feel stuffed them on her feet without checking which was which, shouldered her duffel, and put on the jacket. She eased out of her room and down the back stairs, placing each foot on the outer edge of each step, the way she had practiced the week before mapping the boards that did not creak. She was out the back door and into the cold November air before the clock in the kitchen reached midnight. It was 3 blocks later, under the amber smear of a highway ramp light, that she stopped to check her shoes. 1 pink sneaker, 1 white one. She stared at them for a moment, then kept walking. She hitchhiked through the early hours on the eastern edge of Nevada, catching rides with 2 long-haul truckers and a retired school teacher heading west for a family Thanksgiving. None of them asked too many questions. She offered nothing extra. She rode in passenger seats, watching the desert go dark blue, and then black, and then pale gray, as morning came, and she kept her hands in the pockets of the jacket and her face turned toward the window. By mid-afternoon, she had covered close to 280 miles. She had eaten a granola bar from her bag and nothing else since the group home dinner the night before. The last trucker dropped her at a junction on Highway 50, just inside Nevada, and she stood in the white desert sun with her duffel on one shoulder and looked up and down the road before she spotted the low brown shape of a diner set back from the highway behind a patched asphalt lot. A sign above the door read, "The Iron Spur." Below it in smaller letters, open 6 to 10, coffee always on. She went inside. The interior was dim after the glare of the desert booths along the walls, a counter with spinning stools, a pass-through to a kitchen where something was frying. A woman about 60 with her hair in a loose knot behind the counter looked up when the door opened, gave Layla a brief neutral assessment, and went back to refilling a napkin dispenser. Layla took the last booth in the back corner, set her duffel on the seat beside her, as a soft barrier between herself and the rest of the room, and studied the laminated menu. The cheapest item was a cup of soup at $2.25. She ordered a glass of water from the woman who came to the table without a notepad and sat with both hands wrapped around it while the ice melted. The water was warm. She had not eaten enough. The jacket hung off her shoulders like armor that belonged to someone twice her size, and the smell of it, leather and time, and something she had no name for, except that it had always meant safety, was the closest thing to comfort she had. She counted her money for the third time. $4.75. 300 miles still between her and Fresno. She heard them before she saw them. The sound came from the highway. First, a low vibration she felt in the soles of her feet, before it registered in her ears the way her father had once told her. You felt a bad bearing before you heard it. Within seconds, the vibration became a rumble, and the rumble became a roar, a compressed wall of engine noise that built and built until the entire front face of the diner was rattling, the glass panes shivering in their frames, the silverware on the table trembling faintly against the laminate. Then they came into the lot. 15 motorcycles, Harley-Davidsons, all of them, each one massive and customized in ways that declared purpose rather than decoration. Matte, black, and raw chrome, low-slung and wide-built for highway distance and serious weight. The riders matched the bikes, large men in heavy denim and black leather cuts, the kind of men who took up space without effort, who moved through the world with the settled certainty of people who had not been uncertain about much for a very long time. On the back of every cut, the same insignia, a winged skull, and below it a bottom rocker in white thread on black Nevada. Layla knew what the insignia meant. She pressed herself back against the inside corner of the booth and made herself small. She put the duffel between herself and the aisle and pulled the jacket collar up and kept her eyes on the table. Be invisible, she thought, just be invisible. The door opened. The temperature in the diner changed. They filed in, bringing with them the smell of hot asphalt and road dust and the particular atmosphere of men who spend their lives in the open air. And they rearranged the room the way a stone rearranges water, simply by being dropped into it. 4 tables pushed together and the center chairs turned outward. The man at the front of the group was in his late 50s, not tall exactly, but built as if every vertical inch of him was dense and intentional. His beard was the gray and white of old photographs, thick and untrimmed, but not careless, the beard of a man who had stopped performing grooming for other people long ago. Both his arms, from wrist to rolled sleeve, were covered in faded blue-black ink, the kind of work that accumulated over decades rather than being designed in a single session. He moved to the central table without looking around the room first, because he was the kind of man who knew without checking that the room had adjusted to him rather than the reverse. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Rex Callahan. The road name stitched on his cut was Stone. Behind him came others, Wade Boone, heavy-set and quiet, a red bandana folded and tied at his hairline. And behind them, still moving with the faintly overcalculated energy of someone who had not yet fully grown into the space they occupied, a younger man, late 20s, blonde hair slicked back above a jagged scar that tracked from the corner of his jaw down across his chin. His cut was newer than the others, the leather less broken in the patches still holding sharp edges. He moved through the room with the kind of restless bravado that announces itself before the person behind it has decided what it means. His name was Colt Briggs. For the first 10 minutes, Layla's strategy of invisibility held. The group was loud enough and self-contained enough that a girl alone in a corner booth was easy to overlook. She kept her eyes down and measured the distance to the side exit and thought about how much of Highway 50 she could cover before dark. Then Colt Briggs got bored, but she felt it before she saw it, the way the atmosphere on that side of the room shifted slightly, the way a conversation quieted and the quality of the quiet changed. She did not look up. A moment later, she heard the scrape of a chair. "Hey," Colt's voice aimed at her. She did not respond. "Hey," louder, "I am talking to you." She kept her eyes on the table. "You deaf?" The voice moved closer. She heard his boots on the linoleum. From the main table, she was aware of Rex Callahan glancing over, not intervening, watching. Colt stopped at the edge of her booth. She could see his boots in her peripheral vision, scuffed and road-worn, planted with the particular stance of someone who wanted to be looked at. "I just want to know where a little girl gets a jacket 3 sizes too big." Layla did not answer. "Looks to me like she borrowed it off somebody who is not around to ask for it back." She looked up then because she had calculated that looking up was safer than continuing to ignore him. She met his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, not unintelligent, but trained at the moment on the wrong thing entirely. "It was my father," she said. "Leave me alone." Colt tilted his head. Did he know you had it? He died. Her voice was flat. She did not put anything in it on purpose. The flatness was just what was there. Something moved behind Colt's eyes, a flicker of what might have been discomfort there and gone. Then the bravado resettled. Road-worn leather like that is not for civilians, he said. He reached forward and put his hand on the lapel of the jacket. Layla moved. Not thought, not decision, pure reflex. She grabbed the strap of her duffel from the seat beside her and swung it upward, and it caught Colt across the outside of the knee with a dense thwack of packed canvas. He stumbled back one step more from surprise than pain. She was already moving, sliding out of the booth on the far side, duffel in hand. Colt recovered fast, and his hand caught the shoulder of the jacket, yanked, and she twisted to pull free, and the momentum of it swung her around, and for one long, terrible, exposed second, she was facing away from him, with the full width of her back to the fluorescent light overhead. The diner went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, the Way's sound is cut by a switch. Every conversation, every clink of silverware, every scrape of a chair. Gone. Colt's hand fell from the jacket. She turned back to face the room and found it frozen. Colt stood with his arms still extended and his face completely drained of its performative confidence, the color going out of it in real time. He was not looking at her face. He was looking past her, at her back. Slowly, without knowing why, she reached back and pulled the collar of the jacket into place on her shoulders. She heard the sound of a chair moving at the main table. Heavy, deliberate. Then footsteps unhurried crossing the linoleum toward her. Rex Callahan stopped behind her. She did not turn around. She stood still while he looked at the back of the jacket, and the room was so quiet she could hear the fluorescent tube above buzzing faintly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he walked around to stand in front of her, and she saw his face up close for the first time, and she understood that the look on it was not threat and was not aggression. It was something she did not have an immediate word for. Grief, maybe, or the face of a man who has turned a corner and walked unexpectedly into a room from his own past. Ironclad Jack, he said. It was not a question. It was the way you say a name when you are confirming to yourself that the thing you are seeing is real. He looked at Colt. The diner had not moved. The men at the central table were all standing, not having decided to stand, having just found themselves on their feet. Rex said 2 words. Cut. Down. Colt's hands went to the front of his vest. She watched him unbutton it with fingers that were not quite steady, watched him slide it off his shoulders, and then he bent forward and laid it flat on the linoleum with a care that was almost reverent. And then he walked to the front door and went outside and did not look back. The door closed. Rex Callahan pulled out the chair across from Layla's booth and sat down in it, and he gestured to the seat across from him in a way that contained no compulsion. Only an invitation, and she sat, because her legs were not entirely reliable at that moment, and because everything in the room was now pointing toward this man as the still point around which everything else turned. Brenda, he said to the countrywoman without looking away from Layla. Cheeseburger, everything on it. Fries, chocolate shake. He waited until the woman had retreated to the kitchen before he spoke again. Your name, he said. Layla. Layla Donovan. He nodded once as if a piece of something had been confirmed. He put both forearms on the table and looked at her the way men who have seen a great deal look at things they are trying to understand completely before they say a word about them. Your father was a nomad, he said. Do you know what that means in our world? She shook her head. It means he belonged to no single chapter. He rode alone across territory, answered only to the national organization. He came and went. You did not own a nomad, and he did not owe you, except that when something mattered, he was there, and you could count on that. He paused. 20 years ago, in September of 2004, a cartel out of Las Vegas tried to expand their distribution through our territory. They wanted us to open the highways for them. We refused, so they came to make an example of the Nevada Charter. 4 black SUVs, 2 pickup trucks, automatic weapons. 23 of our men were in that clubhouse in the desert outside of Laughlin. He stopped, looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. Your father was passing through. He was not even a member of our chapter. He was carrying a message for the chapter president, and he was supposed to ride out the next morning. He had no obligation to us whatsoever. The kitchen sounds continued behind the pass-through. Somewhere outside, the desert wind moved across the parking lot. When the cartel came, Rex said your father stood in the front doorway of that clubhouse with a 12-gauge shotgun, and he held it. He held it alone. He gave 23 men time to get out through the back, and he took 2 rounds in the chest doing it. Every one of those 23 men is alive today because Jack Donovan stood in a doorway and refused to move when any reasonable person would have run. The national president came to the clinic where we patched him up and sewed that patch onto his cut himself while Jack was still bleeding on the table. Nomad, highest honor, savior of Chapter 8. Layla had her hands flat on the table. She was not crying. The news was too large for crying, too large for any immediate response. It sat in her like a stone dropped into deep water, the impact known, but the settling still in progress. Did he know, she said. About me, when he made that choice. Rex was quiet for a moment. I do not know, he said. And that was the right answer, the only honest one, and she respected him for it more than she would have respected any reassurance he might have manufactured. The food arrived. She did not realize how hungry she was until the plate was in front of her, and she had eaten half the cheeseburger before she thought to slow down. Rex drank his coffee. He did not watch her eat, looked deliberately at the middle distance, the way she would later learn he always did when someone was doing something they needed to do without being observed. There was a bounty on your father after that night, he said, when she had eaten enough to have some of herself back. The man he stopped in that doorway was the father of the cartel's second-in-command, a man named Harlan Vance. The bounty was $750,000. Every criminal organization from Vegas to the border was looking for ironclad Jack. He disappeared because if he had stayed visible, the target was not just on him. It was on everyone near him. She was quiet. He spent his life keeping that off you, Rex said. She understood it now with a completeness that felt like a door swinging open onto a room she had always lived adjacent to without knowing it was there. The slowing cars, the jacket in the closet, the things he never explained. She reached into the inside of the jacket, then working her fingers along the left panel to the seam she had opened in her room at the group home, and she drew out the folded index card and placed it on the table between them. He hid this in the jacket, she said. Rex picked it up carefully. Read it. His face did not change much, but something in it deepened the way water deepens when you move from the shallows. He set it back on the table. Dottie Donovan is his older sister, Rex said. She has been in Fresno for 30 years. I have not spoken to her in 15 years, but she is in the charter's contacts because Jack asked us years ago to keep track of her without her knowing, to make sure she was safe. Layla looked at the card. He thought of everything she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He was that kind of man, Rex said. Outside the diner's front window, the afternoon light was starting to angle westward. Then the radio on Wade Boone's belt crackled. Wade stepped away from the table, spoke low, listened. He came back to Rex and leaned down and said something close to his ear. Rex's expression did not change visibly, but something in his posture shifted, a very slight consolidation, the way a structure reinforces itself when it detects a load. He looked at Layla. Can you ride pillion? His voice was even. I have never been on a motorcycle. He nodded once. Then he stood up and looked at the men at the table, and without raising his voice, he said 4 words. Saddle up, precious cargo. And the room moved. Layla stood. She reached for her duffel. Before she could shoulder it, Wade Boone took it from her with a matter-of-fact gesture, not aggressive, simply the practical action of a person who had decided to carry something. And he held it with both hands, the way you hold something that matters. She was moving toward the door when 2 county cruisers turned into the lot, red and blue flashing without sirens, and her stomach dropped. Rex walked out ahead of her. He planted himself at the top of the diner steps, and when the deputies got out of their vehicles, he met them in the lot with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who has had this conversation many times and knows exactly how it goes. She watched from inside the door in the shadow of the entryway, the jacket collar up her heart steady but loud. She heard one of the deputies say the words Utah and runaway and teenage girl. She heard Rex say, we mind our own business on the road. Have not seen a hitchhiker all day. A pause. Then 10 minutes, Brennan. Rex, you got it. He stepped back inside. He looked at her in the shadow of the doorway with the afternoon sun bright and flat behind him, and in that fraction of a moment she thought about her father standing in another doorway, the one in the desert outside Laughlin in 2004, and she thought about what he must have felt before the cartel came, whether it was fear or something larger than fear, something that had already moved past fear into pure decision. She thought she understood it now. Rex looked at her for exactly 1 second. "We ride," he said. 15 engines came to life in the lot outside one after another, and the sound was enormous and certain and moving. And Layla Donovan walked out of the Iron Spur Diner on Highway 50 into the late afternoon sun and did not look back. Rex handed her a matte black helmet. She put it on. She swung her leg over the rear of the bike. She put her feet on the pegs. She wrapped her hands around his belt. The convoy moved out onto Highway 50, the bikes banking west in a tight V formation, and the desert opened up on either side of the road, wide and pale and boundless, and the wind hit her all at once. She held on. Far back in the lot behind them, she knew the deputies were watching. She knew there was a BOLO with her name on it in the Utah system, and a man named Frank Holden, who had run his lights-out checks in his combination lock pantry and his separate nightly pauses outside her room for reasons she did not yet fully understand. She thought about the note, Dottie Donovan, Fresno. She knows who you are. She thought about what it meant that her father had written that. Not just the information, but the belief behind it that there was someone at the other end of those words who would receive Layla, who would know what to do. The highway unrolled westward in front of them, straight and long, and Rex Callahan rode like he had ridden it 1,000 times before, unhurried, solid as foundation. And behind him, Layla leaned when he leaned, and held when she held, and let the desert fall away behind her, mile by mile. She did not know about the dark blue SUV that had been sitting off the eastern shoulder of Highway 50 for the past 40 minutes, a quarter-mile back from the Iron Spur lot. She did not know that it had pulled out onto the highway 30 seconds after the convoy. She did not know that Wade Boone, watching his mirrors at the back of the formation, had already seen it. The highway west of the Nevada state line runs through a country that does not forgive inattention. The land on both sides of Highway 50 flattens into a pale alkaline expanse, broken only by distant ridge lines the color of old rust, and the sky above it is so large and so indifferent that you stop trying to find its edges. It is the kind of landscape that makes small things feel smaller and large things feel inevitable. And riding through it at highway speed, on the back of a Harley-Davidson with 15 engines roaring around you in tight formation, the wind coming hard and constant from the west, Layla Donovan had to make a conscious effort to remember to breathe. She had never been on a motorcycle before. The reality of it was different from anything she had constructed in her imagination. The bike moved under her with a weight and authority that no car had, a living quality responsive to the road, in a way that transmitted every texture of the asphalt through the frame and into her hands and the soles of her feet. When Rex leaned into a curve, the lean was total and committed, and she had to lean with it, had to give herself to the physics of it completely, or fight it and fall. Her father had told her once when she was 12, and asking why he had never taught her to ride, that a motorcycle did not let you be halfway about anything. He had said it the way he said things that mattered quietly, as if the words did not need emphasis, because the truth in them was already carrying their own weight. She held Rex Callahan's belt with both hands and watched the desert move past at 70 miles per hour and thought about him. Not ironclad Jack, not the nomad who had held a doorway alone with a 12-gauge while 23 men escaped into the desert night. She thought about the version she had actually known, the man who set burned plates on the table without apology, the man who handed tools upward from under a motorcycle without looking to see if anyone was there because he knew she was there. She was always there, the same as gravity was always there. He had been teaching her to listen for the thing underneath the thing, to pay attention before deciding, to feel the problem before naming it. She was not sure whether understanding this made her feel closer to him or farther away. She was still working that out when Wade Boone pulled up alongside Rex on the left flank. Even at speed, she could see the angle of Wade's body, the deliberate positioning of it, and she knew before Rex acknowledged it that something was being communicated. Rex raised 2 fingers off the handlebar, a signal. The formation shifted almost imperceptibly, tightening the riders at the rear, spacing themselves differently. Layla looked back over her shoulder. A quarter-mile behind the formation in the right lane of the highway, a dark blue SUV held a steady distance, not overtaking, not falling back, holding with a patience that was itself a form of communication. She turned back forward. Her hand stayed loose on Rex Callahan's belt, not gripping from fear, holding from readiness. They rode for another 30 minutes without incident. The sun moved toward the western rim of the sky, and the light on the desert changed color, going from white to a pale amber. The SUV maintained its distance. Rex maintained his course. Near the California state line, where the desert began its first tentative elevation toward the Sierra Nevada foothills, there was a truck stop and gas station set back from the highway behind a wide gravel apron. Rex signaled, and the formation banked off the highway in a long, smooth arc and came to rest in the gravel lot in two rows, engines cutting one by one until the silence came back gradually, like water filling a space. Layla pulled off the helmet. The cool air hit her face. Her hands were stiff from holding, and her lower back ached in a way she had not noticed at speed. She climbed off the bike and stood on the gravel and breathed. Rex was already off his bike. He walked to the rear of the lot and stood with his back to a chain-link fence, and Wade Boone came to him, and they spoke at low volume, Wade leaning in, Rex listening with the still attentiveness of a man who processes information before he responds to it. Then Rex turned and looked at Layla across the lot. A brief, direct look. He tilted his head once. She crossed the gravel to him. Wade stepped back 2 paces and turned to face outward, watching the highway apron hands in his jacket pockets. Rex spoke without preamble. Charter Fresno confirmed your aunt this morning while we were riding. Dottie Donovan lives on Crestfield Lane in the north part of the city, has been there 12 years. They have someone who drives past the street. It is clean. Layla nodded. There is something else. She waited. When Wade called the charter this morning, he also ran something for me. I had asked him to before we left the diner. I asked an old contact in Salt Lake City to look at your father's hospital admission. He paused, not from reluctance, from precision, making sure the next sentence landed correctly. The medical record shows heart failure. That is accurate. His heart had been in poor condition for some time. What the record also shows is a phone call to his room at the hospital at 11:48 in the evening, approximately 15 minutes before his cardiac event was recorded. Layla was very still. The call came from a number registered to a prepaid account, Rex said. Untraceable by standard means. But the timestamp and the pattern of the account are consistent with how Harlan Vance's organization operates. He watched her face. I cannot tell you with certainty what was said on that call. I cannot tell you with certainty that it caused what happened. What I can tell you is that it was not coincidence. Vance had been tracking your father for years. Your father was sick, and Vance knew it. That call was an offer, or it was a threat, or it was both. Layla looked at the highway. The dark SUV had not followed them into the lot. It had continued west and was now invisible, which was in some ways worse than being visible. She thought about her father in a hospital bed, already in a body that was failing him, receiving a phone call in the dark. She could hear his voice, clearly flat, and certain the same voice that said, "Old habit, and God help you," in 3/8. She knew without needing to be told what his answer would have been. She said he would not have given them anything. No, Rex said, he would not. She said, so the call did not give Vance what he wanted. Rex was quiet. But it gave Vance something else, she said. He found out Dad was dying. He found out the jacket was going to be unprotected. Rex looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man recalibrating something. She thought about Frank Holden, the way he moved through the group home, the specific quality of his attention, the calls he took in his car with the windows up, the way he had paused outside her room more than any other. She said, Holden knew who I was. Rex said nothing. From the day I arrived, she said, he was not watching me because I was a runaway. He was watching me because someone told him to watch me specifically, someone who needed to know where I was. Rex said, that is what the charter found when Wade made his calls. She turned to look at him directly. Frank Holden has been receiving payments from an account connected to Vance's organization for 14 months, Rex said. The payments started 2 months before your father died. Vance was planning ahead. She took a breath. Let it out. He put me in a house that was already his, she said. Rex said yes. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She checked them because she wanted to know, and they were the same hands that had found the 3/8 socket in the dark by feel alone. Her father had spent 17 years keeping Harlan Vance at a distance. He had changed his life entirely, set aside his colors and his brothers and the road he had been born to ride, and he had done it with such completeness and such quiet that she had never even known there was a distance being kept. He had given up everything to protect something small and ordinary. Pancakes on a Saturday morning, a girl on the hood of a Chevy with a library book, the right socket passed upward without being asked. And then he had gotten sick, and the distance had started to close, and he had known it was closing, and he had written a note and hidden it in the lining of the jacket and trusted that she was the kind of person who would find it. He had been right. "I am not running anymore," she said. Her voice was even. It was not a declaration. It was an observation, the same flat certainty she had inherited from him, the tone of a person stating something that has already been resolved. "I am going to Fresno, and I am going to find Dottie, and I am going to find out what he wanted me to know. And then I am going to deal with Harlan Vance." Rex Callahan studied her for 3 long seconds. Then he said, "We ride in 10 minutes. They had been back on the highway for 40 minutes, the Sierra Nevada foothills, rising ahead of them in long brown folds that caught the late afternoon sun on their western faces when Wade Boone laid on his horn. 3 short blasts. Rex felt it in his shoulders before the sound reached her, the almost invisible consolidation of a man who has just received the signal he was waiting for and has shifted from watchfulness into readiness. His left hand went briefly to the handlebar signal, and the formation responded, spacing changing, the 2 rear riders dropping back and fanning outward. Layla looked back. 2 vehicles had come off a side road that intersected the highway a quarter mile behind them and were accelerating hard. The dark blue SUV, which had apparently looped ahead, and waited in behind it a black pickup truck with a reinforced front bumper. They were not maintaining distance anymore. Rex said close to her ear, his voice under the wind and engine noise, "Hold on! Do not let go for any reason." She locked her hands on his belt, not from fear, from decision. The throttle opened under her, and the bike surged forward with a force that pressed her back into the seat, and she felt the change in the road beneath them as Rex picked a different line, angling toward a side route that cut north into the foothills, a road he apparently knew. The formation followed without a signal because they had ridden roads like it before, because 15 years of riding together meant communication did not require words any more than she had needed to ask her father which socket to hand him. The road narrowed as it climbed. 2 lanes became 1.5, the asphalt going older and rougher, seamed with frost damage, and bordered by pine trees that crowded the shoulder and cut the fading daylight into slanted panels of orange and shadow. The SUV stayed behind them, not losing ground on the uphill. Gunfire. The flat snap and whine of bullets moving through air faster than the mind could track, and the sound of one of them sparking off metal somewhere behind her was different from anything she had a frame for. She did not flinch. She noted it, filed it, kept her hands on the belt. Rex navigated the bike through a hard left curve that the SUV took wide, losing a second, and in that second, Colt Briggs, who had been riding 3 back in the formation on the outside right, pulled forward alongside the pickup truck in a move that made no tactical sense unless you understood it as something other than tactics. She saw him from the corner of her eye. The pickup was accelerating to come alongside Rex, trying to cut off the lead bike, and Colt pulled even with it, and for a moment the 2 vehicles ran side by side on a road that barely had room for one of them. Then Colt reached across and hit the driver's side mirror of the pickup with the flat of his forearm, hard, and the driver reacted instinctively, twitching the wheel, and the truck went wide, and its front right wheel caught the soft shoulder, and it fishtailed hard before the driver recovered. It bought them 30 seconds. Rex used them. The road ahead bent around the shoulder of a hill, and on the other side of the bend, Layla could see in the last of the evening light the dark shapes of old structures set back among the trees, a rusted equipment shed, stacked timber, the skeletal geometry of a logging operation that had shut down long enough ago that young pines were growing up through the gaps in the piled wood. Rex went in without slowing the bike, throwing gravel, and the formation followed him in a tight, controlled scatter, and by the time the SUV and the pickup came around the bend, the bikers had already dissolved into the shadows of the old camp. The 2 vehicles came to a stop at the camp entrance, high beams flooding the clearing. Engines off. Silence, the particular dense silence of a forest at dusk, broken by ticking metal and the distant sound of wind moving through the upper branches. Rex set his bike down on jam carefully as if it deserved that consideration even now, and he moved into the shadow of the large equipment shed in one fluid motion, and she moved with him because she was watching him and doing what he did, which was the right thing to do. Men came out of the two vehicles, 8 of them, moving with a practiced fanning motion of people who had done this before. They wore tactical vests, and they held their weapons in a way that was professional, and the whole scene in the headlight glare had the quality of something that had been prepared elsewhere and was now being executed. Layla was behind the equipment shed with her back to the corrugated metal wall, crouching, the jacket enormous around her, her breathing measured and controlled. From this angle, she could see a gap between the shed and a pile of cut timber that gave her a partial sightline to the clearing. Rex was 2 feet to her left. He did not look afraid. He looked the way he had looked reading the patch on the back of her jacket, settled and entirely present, a man for whom the situation had become simple rather than complex, because the only question that mattered was what to do next. The men from the vehicles were moving through the clearing, and the bikers were moving through the trees, and the shadows in ways she could not fully track, and it was then that she heard it. A single engine, far back on the road, coming fast, coming impossibly fast for this road, for this terrain, for the near dark and the gravel surface, coming at the speed of something that was not calculating the odds, because it had already calculated them and set them aside. Through the gap between the shed and the timber, she saw the headlight first. A single beam cutting through the trees from the road, weaving through the last curve, and then the bike was in the clearing, and it was not slowing. No cut. A white t-shirt in the headlight, glare vivid as a flag. She understood what Colt Briggs was doing in the half-second before he did it, and she could not look away. He stood on the pegs in the last 10 yards. She saw him look across the clearing, and she was almost certain in the compressed slow motion of that fraction of a second that he was not looking at the SUV. He was looking at her, a single direct look, less than a heartbeat, that had the character of something that had already been decided and did not require the other person to agree with it because it was not a question. Then he kicked the bike sideways and threw himself clear. The bike traveled the last 8 yards on its side in a shower of sparks and gravel and hit the front of the SUV at 40 miles an hour with a sound that was less like a crash than like a sentence ending. The gas tank ruptured, and the fire came immediately, a hard orange pulse that lit the entire clearing and knocked the 2 nearest men off their feet and sent the others stumbling backward. Layla did not move for 1 second. 2. The fire was enormous. The SUV was finished. 3 of the 8 men were on the ground, and the others were scrambling backward toward the tree line, and the bikers who had been in position around the clearing were moving now, moving with the speed and coordination of men who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And the clearing that had been about to become something very bad became something else entirely in the space of 30 seconds. Rex was already moving toward where Colt had come down. Layla moved with him. Colt was on the ground 30 feet from the burning SUV on his back, one arm bent at an angle that was wrong, his white t-shirt torn and dark along the left side where the gravel had taken it. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking. When Rex crouched over him, Colt's first motion was an attempt to sit up, which Rex stopped with one large hand on his chest. "He is going to be all right," Rex said. The tone was not reassuring. It was diagnostic. Colt turned his head and found Layla standing 2 feet away, and the expression on his face was not what she expected from a man lying in gravel with a broken arm. It was not pain, and it was not heroism. It was more ordinary than either. It was the expression of someone who has done a thing they should have done earlier and knows it and is at peace with the timing regardless. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You are an idiot." Colt made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same general territory. Rex reached into the saddlebag of his own bike and pulled out the leather vest he had taken from Colt at the diner. He walked back and set it down on the gravel next to Colt, not with ceremony, just with placement, the way you set a tool down in the right spot for the next person to pick up. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Colt looked at the cut on the gravel beside him. Then he put his good hand on it. Wade Boone had his phone out and was talking to someone, giving coordinates, calm and efficient, and within the hour there would be vehicles from the Fresno charter coming up the mountain road with men who knew wilderness medicine and a truck that could carry what needed carrying. For now, the fire was burning down to something manageable, and Layla stood in the cooling mountain air with the jacket pulled around her and watched Rex direct the aftermath with the unhurried competence of a man who had long ago decided that when something needed doing, the question was only how, not whether. She was not shaking. She checked the way she had checked her breathing on the highway, and she was not. She thought about the clearing and the headlight cutting through the dark and the single direct look from a man who had decided something. She thought about doorways. There seemed to be a pattern in the people who mattered to her, a willingness to stand in openings and hold them to use their own body as the answer to a question that no one else was answering. Her father in a desert clubhouse in 2004. Colt Briggs in a logging camp in the Sierra Nevada in 2024. She wondered if it was something you were born with or something that accumulated in you through the years, until it reached a level where it simply expressed itself when the moment came without decision, without calculation, as naturally as water finding the lowest point. She thought she might know the answer. She thought her father might have been trying to teach it to her for 17 years without calling it by its name. They came down out of the Sierra Nevada in the dark, the formation smaller, now missing one bike that would never run again. Wade Boone in the rear with two Fresno men who had come up the mountain and turned back with them. The road unspooled under the headlights in a long, pale ribbon, and the valley opened up ahead of them, the lights of Fresno in the far distance, making a faint glow against the belly of the clouds. Layla rode behind Rex and did not speak because there was nothing to say that the ride was not already saying. She thought about Dottie Donovan, a woman she had met once years ago, a memory that had gone soft with time. Her father's sister, the person he had kept carefully at a distance for the same reason he had kept everything carefully at a distance to protect it from the radius of danger that followed him. She thought about the note. She knows who you are. There was a particular kind of knowing implied in that sentence that went beyond information. Her father had not written she knows your name or she knows about you. He had written she knows who you are. As if there was a version of Layla that existed in Dottie Donovan's knowledge that Layla herself had not yet fully accessed. She had been moving toward this her entire life. She understood that now. The Fresno streets were quiet at this hour, residential blocks, with the amber light of front porches in the dark shapes of parked cars. The formation moved through it with a rumble that turned a few lights on in the windows they passed, but they were through the neighborhood streets quickly and onto the block before she had time to prepare herself. Both sides of Crestfield Lane were lined with motorcycles. Not 15, not 20. She tried to count and stopped counting. 60 at least in two long rows stretching the length of the block. Chrome catching the streetlight engines off the whole block, charged with the particular density of a large number of people standing still and silent in a small space. The men beside the bike stood without motion as Rex led the battered convoy down the center of the lane. She could see their faces in the streetlight. Different ages, different builds, but the same quality of attention directed toward the approaching bikes. She understood this was the Fresno Charter and that they had come here for the same reason you come to stand outside a place where something important is happening, not to perform something, but to mark it. At the end of the block, there was a small house with a covered porch. Yellow with white trim, a porch light burning warm and steady. A woman stood on the porch. She had come down to the top step, and she was standing with both hands pressed flat against the front of her cardigan, and she was watching the convoy with an expression that was trying to hold too many things at once and not quite managing it. Rex cut the engine. The convoy went silent. Layla pulled off the helmet. She sat for a moment. Then she swung off the bike and stood on the street in front of the yellow house, and she looked at the woman on the porch. The nose was her father's. The set of the jaw was her father's, and the eyes, even from 20 feet in the streetlight, were the particular hazel that she had grown up seeing every morning in the mirror and had never thought to trace back to its origin. The woman looked at her from the top step, and her voice, when it came, carried fragile, disbelieving hope across the distance between them. "Layla," she said, like the word itself was something she had been saving. And her voice broke on it, not from grief exactly, or not only from grief, but from the specific emotion of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has had to make peace with the possibility that it would never arrive, and now it has arrived, and the adjustment is too large to be dignified about. Layla walked up the front path. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried when the social worker came. She had not cried on the highway or in the diner or behind the equipment shed in the logging camp in the dark. She had grieved, she had felt everything there was to feel, but she had felt it the way her father had taught her to feel things, without losing the thread of what needed to be done. But when Dottie Donovan wrapped her arms around her on that front walkway, and she smelled something she had not smelled in 8 months, something that was the same family of warmth as burned food and old wood, and decades of a particular bloodline living in a particular way, she put her face against her aunt's shoulder and let it. They stood there for a while. The 60 bikers on the street and the battered convoy and the night around Crestfield Lane were all very quiet. Inside, the kitchen light was on. Through the front window, Layla could see a table, and on the table, a plate with a blue cloth napkin folded beside it. Dottie Donovan had set a place at the table. She had been getting ready. She had known in the way that people who have been waiting know that this was the night. In the kitchen, when the food was in front of her and the weight of the day was starting to settle into her bones the way weight does when you have been running on focus and there is finally nowhere left to run to, Dottie sat across the table and put her hands flat on the surface between them. Then she stood up. She went to the counter and opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, the kind of drawer where important things are kept because they need to be closed but should not be in view, and she took out an envelope. It was a standard letter envelope sealed with Dottie's name and Fresno address written on the front in her father's block capitals. The postmark said January 2024, 2 months before he died. Dottie set it on the table. She had clearly already opened it and read it. She sat back down and looked at Layla and did not speak because the letter was going to speak. Layla picked it up. She took out the single folded page inside. Jack Donovan's handwriting, the same block letters as the note in the jacket lining, but here given more room, the letters slightly larger, slightly more careful. The handwriting of a man who understood this was the last version of something and wanted to get it right. She read it. If Layla finds you, it means I ran out of time. I want you to tell her this from me word for word if you can. I chose her over the jacket every single day. Not because the jacket was not important. It was. The men it represents are real, and the debt is real, and I will carry it wherever I am when you read this. But a man can carry a debt and still know what is worth more than the debt. I knew that from the day she was born. She read the next part. The road I did not ride was the best ride of my life. She set the letter on the table. Dottie said very quietly, he knew he was sick. He had known for over a year. His doctor told him last autumn that the heart was not going to hold. He could have come back. He could have reached out to the Brotherhood and put you both under protection. He chose to stay in Salt Lake City. He chose to keep the life ordinary for as long as it could be ordinary. He did not want you growing up in the shadow of this. She paused. He stayed in that house and burned the food and fixed the engines until he could not anymore, Dottie said. And then he made sure you had a way through. Layla looked at the letter on the table. She said he was not perfect. Dottie said no. He absolutely was not. She said he kept too much from me. He did, Dottie said. That was his nature. He protected people by carrying things alone, and he was not always right about which things to carry. Layla nodded. Then she said, but he did not run again. When Vance was closing in, when he knew he was dying, he stayed in that house. He stayed with me. Dottie was quiet. He stayed and made sure I knew how to use the right tools, Layla said. And he wrote that note, and he trusted me to find it. That was the last thing he did. Dottie reached across the table and put her hand over Layla's. Outside on Crestfield Lane, the engines remained silent. 60 men who had never met Jack Donovan stood in the dark to mark something they understood without having been told about it, because some debts did not require an explanation. Rex Callahan stood at the end of the walkway and looked at the kitchen window where the light was on, and two women sat across from each other at a table, and the expression on his weathered face was the closest thing to peace that his face knew how to hold. And then at the end of the block where Crestfield Lane met the cross street, a car turned in slowly. Long and dark, moving with that particular deliberate pace she had learned to recognize before she learned to name it. A Lincoln Town car. Alone. It came to a stop 50 yards from the nearest row of motorcycles. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was in his early 50s, tall and lean, silver hair, a suit that had been expensive before the long drive. He stood beside the open door and looked at the 60 bikes and the battered convoy, and the yellow house at the end of the lane with its porch light on, and he did not reach inside his jacket. He stood with his hands visible at his sides. Rex Callahan turned from the kitchen window and looked at the Lincoln for a longer moment. Then he started walking toward it. Rex Callahan walked toward the Lincoln the way he walked toward everything that required his attention, without hurry and without hesitation, as if the distance between himself and the thing that needed facing was simply something to be covered and then done with. The man standing beside the car did not move. He kept his hands at his sides and his eyes on Rex, and he waited with a stillness that was different from the stillness of the bikers on the street. Theirs was the stillness of people standing at attention for something. His was the stillness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down and was now simply standing in the place where he had set it, not sure yet what came next. Rex stopped, 6 feet away. "Harlan Vance," he said. Vance nodded once. "I am not here to fight," Vance said. His voice was flat and controlled and carried the faint hoarseness of a long drive, or a long time not sleeping, or both. "I am not here to threaten. I came alone and I am standing here in front of 60 of your people with my hands where you can see them. I need 5 minutes with the girl." Rex said, "That is not your decision to make." "I know," Vance said. "I am asking." Rex looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the yellow house without answering. Inside the kitchen was warm, and the light above the table had the amber quality of old fixtures, the kind that made everything look like a photograph from 30 years ago. Dottie had her hands wrapped around a mug. Layla was still holding her father's letter, not reading it, just holding it. Rex came through the door. He looked at Layla. "Harlan Vance is at the end of the street, alone. He is asking to speak with you." Dottie's hands tightened around the mug. Rex said, "I told him nothing. It is your call." Layla set the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Her father's block capitals on the page, the careful pressure of the pen, the word he had spent 20 years not saying out loud now said in ink on paper 2 months before he died. She thought about what he had chosen. Not the doorway in the desert, not the shotgun and the 2 rounds in the chest. The other choice, the one that came after the one that lasted 17 years. He had chosen the ordinary life. He had chosen the burned food in the garage and the socket passed upward in the summer heat. He had made that choice knowing it was a retreat, knowing there was a man somewhere at the other end of a bounty who had not forgotten, and he had made it anyway because some things were worth more than the debt. But he had stayed. When the sickness came and the distance was closing, he had not run again. He had stayed in that house and made sure she had a way through. Staying was the bravest thing he had ever done. Braver than the doorway. She said, "I will talk to him." Dottie said, "Layla." "I know," Layla said. "But if I do not face him now, I will spend the rest of my life waiting for him to appear at the end of a street somewhere. I would rather it be this street, tonight, with Rex standing 20 feet away." Rex looked at her with the same expression he had worn when she told him she was not running anymore. He said, "Public place. 3 blocks from here there is a diner. You sit where I can see you from the counter. You say the word and it stops." She nodded. Dottie reached across the table and put her hand flat over Layla's. She held it there for 3 seconds, then let go. Rosie's kitchen was open until midnight and quiet at this hour, 4 booths along the left wall, and a counter with 7 stools along the right, checkered tablecloths in red and white. The smell of coffee that had been going since 6 in the morning, and pies in a rotating glass case near the register. A woman in her 50s, with her hair in a gray ponytail, was wiping down the counter when they came in, and she looked at Rex Callahan and then at the man who came in behind Layla, and then she very calmly went to the far end of the counter and found something to do there. Rex took the 3rd stool from the left. The angle gave him a clear line of sight to the corner booth in the chrome surface of the napkin dispenser, and he did not look at Layla after he sat down. He looked at the napkin dispenser. Colt Briggs was outside the front door with his arm in a makeshift splint, standing with his weight even not leaning. He had wanted to come in. Rex had told him no. He was outside anyway, which was not the same as following instructions, but was close enough. Layla sat in the corner booth. Harlan Vance sat across from her. Up close, he was more tired than she had expected. The suit was good, but the man inside it had the quality of something that had been running on momentum rather than fuel for longer than was sustainable. His face had the deep-set lines of someone who slept badly or did not sleep enough, or had not permitted himself the kind of rest that actually restored anything. His hands on the table were still, but the stillness was maintained rather than natural. He looked at her face for a moment. "You look like him," he said. He said it the same way Rex had said it at the diner, as a statement of fact before anything else, the face doing the work of identification before the conversation began. Same eyes, same way of holding still. She said nothing. Vance ordered black coffee from the woman at the counter. Layla ordered nothing. The woman brought the coffee and retreated. Vance wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking from it. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that I am not telling it to you as an excuse. I am telling it to you because I think you deserve to know the full shape of it." She waited. "My father," he said. His name was Douglas Vance. He was 44 years old in September of 2004. He was the second in command of an organization that did a great deal of harm in a great many places, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He was not a good man by most measures that matter. He was capable of cruelty. He ordered things that I knew about and said nothing, and that silence has not left me. It has not left me in 20 years. He stopped, looked at the mug. "But he was my father," he said, "and I was 12 years old and I watched him die." He looked at Layla. "I was in the back of the truck on the perimeter of that property. I was not supposed to be there. I had hidden in the truck because I wanted to see what my father did, what his work actually was, the way a 12-year-old boy wants to understand the reality of the man he is trying to become. And I watched your father stand in that doorway, and I watched the whole thing, and then your father looked at the truck, and he looked at me." He paused. "I have thought about that look for 20 years, he said. "Every version I come up with is different. Some nights I think it was nothing, just a man scanning the perimeter doing his job. Other nights I think he saw me and made a choice and let me run because I was a child, and he was the kind of man who did not do certain things regardless of what the tactical situation required." He picked up the coffee and set it down without drinking. "I built a life around the idea that the second version was wrong," he said. "Because if the second version was right, then your father spared me. And if your father spared me, then what I have spent 20 years doing does not make sense. You cannot spend 20 years hunting a man who showed you mercy when you were 12 and also tell yourself you are the wrong party. You cannot hold both things. So I decided the first version was true, and I held on to it." His voice had changed. It had become accurate in a way it had not been at the start, the way an instrument sounds when it stops being out of tune. "Layla said you called him the night he was admitted to the hospital." Vance looked at her without surprise. He had known she would know. "Yes," he said. She said, "What did you say to him?" "I made him an offer. Surrender the jacket, the physical jacket, the patch, and I would consider the debt settled. I would take your name off the list. I would instruct my people to stop monitoring the situation." He was quiet. He said no. Vance said. He did not say it with anger. He did not argue. He listened to the offer, and he said quietly that the jacket belonged to his daughter and that he would not be doing that. And then he said something else. He paused. He said, "I know you were in that truck. I have always known. You were 12 years old and you did not choose to be there. Consider this my second answer." Layla was very still. Then he hung up. Vance said, "I did not know he was dying. I did not know that call was the last conversation he would have about this. I thought it was another round in a long game. I found out 3 days later that he had died that same night." The diner was very quiet. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. At the counter, Rex Callahan sat with his coffee and looked at the chrome napkin dispenser and did not move. Vance reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man who knows the room is watching his hands, he took out a folded sheaf of papers, 5 or 6 pages, and he set them on the table between them. "This is Frank Holden," he said. "Payment records, communication logs, instructions from my organization over a period of 14 months beginning in January of 2023. It documents what he was paid, how much, what he was directed to do, and by whom. It is complete and it is accurate, and every figure in it is verifiable." Layla looked at the papers but did not touch them yet. "Holden was placed in that group home 8 years ago," Vance said. "We have had arrangements with certain placements in that system for some time. When my people identified your father's declining health and your likely placement as a ward of the state, Holden was given specific direction to identify you when you arrived and to ensure you did not leave the placement without our knowing. He was holding me, Layla said. Not for my safety. No, Vance said. Not for your safety. She said for yours. He did not deny it. She said you wanted to know where I was so that when the time came to pressure me about the jacket, you would know exactly where to apply the pressure. That is accurate, Vance said. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the 11-year-old in the group home who had trouble sleeping. She thought about the 14-year-old who ate too fast. She thought about Holden's combination lock and his nightly rounds and his windows-up phone calls. She said, how old were you when your father died? 12, Vance said. She said, my father saw you in that truck. He let you run. Vance went completely still. She said he could have. You were right there. He had the sight line and the means and the circumstances would have given him every justification. But he made a choice. He saw a 12-year-old boy and he let him run. She said you spent 20 years hunting a dead man's jacket. You put a child in a house run by someone on your payroll. You made a phone call to a dying man in a hospital bed and offered him a deal he was never going to take. And at some point in all of that, every single time, you had a choice. She said, was the life he gave you worth any of what you did with it? The question sat in the diner like something physical, like a stone dropped on a table, solid and undeniable in the space between them. Vance did not answer immediately. He looked at the papers he had placed on the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the table surface. And then he looked at Layla Donovan, 17 years old in a jacket that was enormous on her and had seen more of the world than she had, and his face did something she had not expected it to do. It did not harden. It did not close. It moved in the opposite direction towards something that had been locked behind the wrong door for a very long time and was now finding the right one. No, he said. His voice was not broken. It was honest. It was possibly the most honest word he had spoken in 20 years, and both of them knew it. No, it was not worth it. It was not close to worth it. Silence. He said, I have been doing this long enough to know what the end of it looks like. My organization is not what it was. The men who built it with my father are dead or in federal custody, or they have made their own calculations and found different answers than I did. There is nothing left to protect except the story I told myself, and I am tired of the story. He looked at the papers. I came here, he said, because I am going to be in federal custody before the end of this week. Not running, turning myself in to a prosecutor in Sacramento with whom I have been in preliminary conversation for the past 6 months. The arrangement requires full cooperation and full documentation of the organization's activities over the past 22 years. He tapped the papers. These are yours regardless, he said. This is not part of any negotiation. Holden needs to be in a building where he cannot touch another child. I cannot undo what was done to you or to the others in that house. But this is what I have that addresses it directly, and I am giving it to you because it is the right thing to do, and because your father showed me what right looks like, and I have been looking away from it for too long. Layla looked at the papers. She thought about her father writing the note in the jacket lining. She thought about him writing the letter to Dottie. She thought about him on the phone in a hospital bed in March already in a body that was failing him, hearing the offer and saying no, and then saying something else, something that was not strategy and was not negotiation, but was just true. I know you were in that truck. Consider this my second answer. Her father had carried a debt his whole life. The debt of the doorway and the patch and the 23 men who had walked out the back of a desert clubhouse because he had bought them time. But also a deeper debt, the one that comes with being a man who has seen what you are capable of and decided to spend the rest of your life being worth it. She understood now that this was what the jacket had always been. Not a trophy, not a piece of history, a reminder, a record of a particular choice made in a particular moment by a man who understood that the choice would follow him everywhere he went and had made it anyway. She said, my father showed mercy twice. Once in the desert in 2004, and once on the phone the night he died. He did it because it was consistent with who he was, not because he thought it would matter, not because he expected anything from it, just because it was right and he was the kind of man who did the right thing when he had the option. She said, I am going to do the same thing. She looked at Vance directly. She said the bounty ends tonight. The monitoring ends tonight. Every person your organization has had any connection to in that foster system, you provide names to the federal prosecutor. Not as part of your deal, as a separate action before the deal because children were involved, and that is not something you negotiate around. She said, in return, the Donovan name ends the vendetta. No retaliation, no history. It is over. She said, do not waste it the way you wasted the first one. Vance was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the table and picked up the sheaf of papers, and he turned to the last page, and he took a pen from his inside pocket, and he signed his name at the bottom of it, under a paragraph she had not read yet, and he pushed it back across the table. He said, there is a provision on the last page. It is a personal statement of account. It says that the debt between the Vance organization and the Donovan family is settled in full by the actions of this night, and that no further claim, obligation, or act of retaliation is to be pursued by any party at any time. He said, I wrote it before I came here. I did not know if you would agree to it. I wrote it because it needed to exist regardless. He stood up. He looked at her one more time. The tired man in the suit with his silver hair and his deep-set eyes, in the particular quality of a person who has set down something they have been carrying so long, they had forgotten what their own posture felt like without it. He said, your father was a better man than mine. I have known that since I was 12 years old, and I spent 20 years trying to make that knowledge mean something different than what it meant. He said, you are your father's daughter. He put money on the table for the coffee. He walked to the door. He went through it without looking back, and the door swung shut, and the small bell above it chimed once in the quiet diner. Rex Callahan set down his coffee cup. He turned on the stool and looked at Layla across the empty diner. She was looking at the last page with Vance's signature, the personal statement of account, the formal end of a 20-year debt written in ordinary pen on ordinary paper in a Fresno diner at 10:30 on a November night. She thought about Frank Holden. She thought about the other 6 children in that house. She thought about what the documents in front of her would do for them. She folded the papers carefully. She put them in the inside pocket of the jacket, the same pocket where she had found the note, the lining seam she had worked open with patient fingers. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet diner with her hands flat on the checkered tablecloth, and she breathed. Rex came and sat across from her. He set his forearms on the table and he looked at her with the look he had been recalibrating all night. He said, you just ended a 20-year war with 8 sentences. She said, my father started ending it 20 years ago. I just finished it. Rex was quiet for a moment. He said, what do you want to do now? She thought about it genuinely, not what the situation required, not what made tactical sense, what she actually wanted. She said, I want to go back to Dottie's house. I want to sit in her kitchen. I want to sleep for about 12 hours. Rex said, that is a reasonable want. She said, and I want to put the jacket somewhere safe. He nodded. She said, not gone, not stored away where no one sees it. Somewhere it can be seen. Somewhere it means what it means. He said, I know a place. The Fresno Charter Clubhouse was an industrial building on the east edge of the city, the kind of building that announced nothing about itself from the outside. It had the quality that certain places earn over decades of genuine use, the walls covered in photographs and old patches, and the kind of objects that accumulate when people return to the same space year after year and leave small pieces of their history there. The smell of it stopped her in the doorway. Old wood and decades of working leather and the dry warmth of a space where engines had been running and tended for 30 years. It was the smell of her father's garage transposed into a different key, the same notes rearranged into a larger composition. She stood there for a moment. Rex led her to a section of the wall near the back of the main room where a glass-fronted case had been mounted and fitted with a small, dedicated light. It was empty. She understood that it had been made empty recently in the hours before they arrived, which meant the charter had known that this night had a shape and a direction, even if no one could have described it exactly in advance. She stood in front of the empty case. Then she reached up and unzipped the jacket. She had been wearing it since the group home. She had slept in it on the seats of long-haul trucks and sat in diners in it and ridden through a desert and a mountain range in it, and it had been across all of that the most constant thing in the world she currently inhabited. She slid it off her shoulders. The leather was warm from her body. She held it for a moment with both hands looking at the back of it, the patch with its faded thread, The skull and the military helmet, the dagger, the letters that had gone soft at the edges with 20 years of road. In memory of ironclad Jack, nomad, highest honor, savior of Chapter 8. She thought he is not gone. He is just somewhere I cannot see him from here. She thought he made burned pancakes and taught me which socket to use and hid a note in the lining of a jacket for me to find when I needed it most. He was not perfect, and he kept too much from me, and he was the best father he knew how to be, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It carried me 300 miles across a desert and through a mountain range and into the room where I needed to be. She thought I am going to be okay. She opened the case and she hung the jacket on the mount inside it with the back facing out and the patch facing out, and she stepped back and Rex reached past her and closed the glass door, and the small light above the case came on and the faded thread caught it. And for a moment the letters were vivid again, the way they must have been when they were first sewn, the way they must have looked on the day a national president stitched them onto a battered nomad's cut in a basement clinic while the man was still bleeding on the table. She looked at it for a while. Rex stood beside her. He did not speak. Then he said, "The Nevada Charter has a vote coming up." She said, "Rex." He said, "When you are ready. Not tonight, not this year, maybe not next year. When it means something to you and not before." She said, "I am 17. He said, "I know what you are. I also know what you are going to be." She looked at the jacket in the case. The weight of it was gone from her shoulders. She had expected to feel lighter without it. She felt something else, instead not lighter, but more accurately weighted, as if the distribution of things had shifted into a configuration that was sustainable for the long distance, rather than only for the emergency. She said, "I need to finish school." He said, "Obviously." She said, "And I need to fix the Harley." He looked at her. She said, "Dad left it to Dottie, the 1979 Electroglide. She has had the title in a drawer for 8 months. It is the one thing that did not get seized. I need to finish what he started." Rex was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you know how long that bike has been a project?" She said, "My entire life." He said, "You think you can finish it?" She said, "He taught me which socket to use." Rex made a sound low in his chest. Not quite a laugh, exactly a laugh. The same family of sound, the same register, and she recognized it because she had heard it 1,000 times in a garage on the west side of Salt Lake City, and she did not know how she was going to explain that to him, and she did not think she needed to. They drove back to Crestfield train through the quiet streets of a sleeping city. The 60 bikes were still there when they arrived, the night watch remaining without being asked to remain, because some things you do not leave until you know it is over. Dottie was on the porch. She had a sweater over her cardigan and a mug in both hands, and she watched the convoy come back down the lane. Layla climbed off the bike. She walked up the front path. Dottie looked at her, looked at the absence of the jacket. She said, "Is it done?" Layla said yes. Dottie let out a long breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a sob, and was more than anything the sound of a woman setting down 20 years of a particular kind of worry. She put her arm around her niece and steered her toward the door. Inside, the kitchen light was still on. Dottie said, "I am going to make breakfast. Sit down." Layla sat. She heard the refrigerator open and close. She heard a pan set on a burner. She heard the gas ignite, the low sound of it, the small, domestic certainty of it. She put her hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at them. 6 months later, the garage behind Dottie Donovan's house on Crestfield Lane had been converted. Not professionally, not with permits, but with tools borrowed from the Nevada Charter's Fresno contact and parts tracked down through a network of people who knew where 1979 Harley-Davidson parts could still be found if you knew the right questions to ask. The hydraulic lift Wade Boone had dropped off in a charter truck one Saturday morning took up most of the left side. The pegboard wall Layla had assembled over 2 weekends held sockets organized by size because that was how you organized them, and there was no reason to do it differently. The Electroglide was on the lift. It had come a long way from the machine she remembered in the corner of her father's garage. The primary chain was sorted. The carb was rebuilt. The electrical system had taken 3 weeks and 2 consultations with a retired mechanic in Stockton who had worked on nothing but Harleys for 40 years and who drove down one Saturday to stand in the garage and look at what she had done and nod in a way that communicated more approval than most people managed with full sentences. The engine had been started twice. Both times it had run clean. Rex Callahan and Wade Boone came on the first Saturday of every month regular, as weather pulling up to the house on Crestfield Lane in the mid-morning with the particular sound she had learned to recognize 2 blocks away. They came ostensibly to check on the bike. They brought food. Rex drank his coffee at the kitchen table and talked to Dottie about things Layla only half listened to, local things, neighborhood things, the small substance of a life being lived in one place over time. Wade always ended up in the garage with Layla, not hovering, not directing, just present, handing things when things needed handing, which was its own kind of conversation. Colt Briggs had driven down from Nevada twice in a car while the arm was healing, and then once on a bike when he was cleared to ride again. The first time he arrived, he stood in the garage doorway for a moment looking at the lift and the pegboard and the electric glide. Then he came in and handed her a socket set he had bought somewhere on the drive down, a complete set in a hard case. She had looked at it. He had said, "Don't make it weird." She had put it on the workbench without comment. The second time he came down, he stayed most of the day. He did not say much. He handed her things when she needed them and held the light when she needed both hands. And at some point in the afternoon, she realized this was probably what he was like when he was not performing anything for anyone, and it was a considerable improvement. When he left, he stood at the end of the driveway for a moment and looked at the bike on the lift through the open garage door. He said, "Your dad would have finished it by now." She said, "My dad was better at this than I am." He said, "Yeah, he was better at a lot of things than most people." He got on his bike and rode north, and she went back to work. Frank Holden had been arrested in December, 6 weeks after Vance's cooperation documents reached the prosecutor in Sacramento. The charges included child endangerment, conspiracy, and obstruction. The other children from the group home had been reevaluated and placed with different oversight. Layla had given a statement to the investigator assigned to the case, 18 minutes on the phone, factual and complete. And when it was over, she had hung up and gone back to the garage. Vance had entered federal custody in early December as well. The process would take years. She did not follow it closely. She had given what she had to give, and she had done what she had come to do. And the rest of it was the business of prosecutors and courtrooms and the long machinery of consequence, which ground slowly and imperfectly, but in this case had enough material to work with. She was enrolled in school 6 blocks from Crestfield Lane in an ordinary building with ordinary hallways and teachers who did not know anything about her except what she chose to tell them. She was a good student. Her father had taught her to pay attention to what things were telling her before she decided what she thought about them. And it turned out this was a useful approach to most subjects. She had one friend, a girl named Pilar from her third period English class, who asked too many questions but asked them with such genuine interest that Layla found she did not mind answering or not answering, or saying, "I will tell you that later," which Pilar accepted without offense and held the later to patiently. On the Saturday morning in May, when the electric glide was ready, she knew it before she started it. She had felt it the previous evening when she was doing the final check, the completeness of it, the absence of any remaining looseness or uncertainty in the machine. Her father had told her, "You always know when an engine is right because the engine tells you before you turn the key." Rex and Wade were in the garage. Dottie was standing in the doorway that connected the garage to the kitchen, a dish towel over her shoulder watching. Layla stood beside the bike. She had taken it off the lift 2 days earlier, and it sat on its own wheels on the garage floor, midnight blue, under the fluorescent light, enormous and patient, and present exactly the same animal it had always been in her father's garage, except that now it was finished. She put on the new jacket, the one from Wade Boone's hands in November, the soft cowhide that had spent 6 months becoming familiar, that smelled now of the garage, and her own days, and the particular combination of things that were hers rather than her father's. It fit differently than it had in November. She was not sure if the jacket had changed or she had, probably both. She swung her leg over. She put her feet on the pegs, the same pegs she had rested her feet on behind Rex Callahan, riding through the Nevada desert for the first time, not knowing how to lean and learning by leaning. She put her hand on the key. In the garage doorway, Dottie pressed the dish towel against her mouth, and her eyes were bright. Layla turned the key. The electric glide started on the first turn, the engine catching and settling into its idle, with the solid, purposeful sound of a machine that knows what it is for, and the sound filled the garage and went out through the open roll-up door into the morning street and kept going out into the air of the neighborhood and beyond it into the larger morning. Rex Callahan stood with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when it approached something it could not quite contain. Wade Boone put his knuckles against his mouth and looked at the ceiling. The engine ran. Layla sat on the bike her father had been rebuilding her entire life in the jacket that was hers now, in the way things are yours when you have earned them through weather rather than purchase. And she listened to the engine for a long moment. She thought smart hands. She thought 3/8. She thought the road I did not ride was the best ride of my life. She revved the engine once, clean and certain the way it answered her, no hesitation, no roughness, nothing unresolved. Then she looked at Rex. He looked at the open garage door, at the street beyond it, at the morning. He said quietly, well. She said, well. Dottie made breakfast. She always made breakfast when everyone was there, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and the sound of the pan, and the ordinary, comfortable noise of a Saturday morning with people in it. Rex sat at the table where he always sat and read the paper the way he always did, and commented on things nobody had asked his opinion about, and Wade filled his coffee cup for the third time standing at the counter because he was the kind of man who preferred to stand. When Dottie brought the plates to the table, Layla looked at hers. The edges were dark, the middles were pale, the particular geometry of a person who could not figure out when to flip something. She looked at Dottie. Dottie looked back at her without apology, like burned edges were simply part of the recipe, like they had always been there and always would be. Rex glanced up from his paper. He said Jack would have loved this. She said he made them better. No, he did not. Rex and Dottie said at exactly the same moment. Layla laughed. Not the careful, controlled sound she had been making for months, the laugh that checked itself before it got too large. The actual laugh, the one that had been waiting since March, since a Tuesday morning when she had gone to the kitchen to start coffee and found the house holding a different quality of stillness. It came out and it was loud and it was real, and it sat in the kitchen the way good things sit in kitchens, like it had always belonged there and was only now finding its way home. She let off the brake, and the Electroglide rolled forward out of the garage and down the driveway and into the morning sun on Crestfield Lane, and the light hit the chrome and the midnight blue paint, and the engine was a steady, living presence beneath her. She sat at the end of the driveway for a moment and felt the bike breathing under her. No roof, no doors, no structure between her and the consequence of a wrong decision. Her father had been right about that. It was the most honest machine there was. She looked down Crestfield Lane at the street that had been full of chrome and silence on a November night 6 months ago, at the neighborhood going about its Saturday morning at the sky above the rooftops, which was wide and very blue and offered no end in either direction. She put it in gear. She rode.